In Scotland, meanwhile, teachers are beginning their 16 days of rolling strike action in an ongoing dispute over pay. Schools in Glasgow and East Lothian will only be open for pupils taking the preliminary exams. It comes after the Scottish Government offered a 5% pay offer on Thursday, but union members demand 10%. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, it may only be the 6th sitting day of the year for Parliament, but everything does seem to be in overdrive in Westminster. In the next 3 days, the Prime Minister must make a decision on whether or not he will use the government's powers under Section 35 of the Scotland Act to strike down the Scottish Parliament's demedicalised gender reforms. Number 10 says they're still waiting on that legal advice. Negotiations over Northern Ireland, that protocol may be nearing a conclusion too, with talk of an intense end-stage so-called negotiation tunnel perhaps approaching. The online regulation bill is back in the Commons this week with multiple amendments that the government must fight or accept. And a controversial expansion of police powers is to be announced today, aimed at finally getting a handle on the sort of civil disruption we've seen over the last few years, from the shutting down of roads to vandalism in museums. Now, yesterday, the policing minister responded to claims that this was a crackdown on the right to protest. Let's listen in.
The Public Order Bill is designed to make sure the public can go about their day-to-day lives without undue or unreasonable disruption by protesters who are trying to disrupt their lives. The amendments that we're introducing in the Lords tomorrow respond to a request from the police to clarify the threshold above which it is right for the police to intervene, the point at which people's day-to-day lives are being seriously disrupted, where people can't get to school with their children, can't get to hospital for critical medical care, or can't get to work to do their job and to earn a living. Lord Hope, the president of this former Vice President of the Supreme Court, has tabled some amendments in this area as well. So we're working closely with people across the House of Lords to make sure this bill respects the right to protest, of course, but at the same time make sure that members of the public don't have their right to go about their daily business infringed as well. Of course, we, as a government, fully respect the right to protest, but that does need to be properly balanced with the right of the general public to go about their day-to-day lives. And where some of these protesters have been deliberately trying to ruin the lives of their fellow citizens, we think that is not acceptable. But it's possible to protest while at the same time allowing ordinary citizens to go about their daily lives.
Policing Minister Chris Philp there, looking somewhat like a geography teacher, discussing that amendment to the legislation. Well, let's discuss it in greater detail. I'm joined by Olivia Utley, our political reporter, and Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, both on the show today. What a treat. Let's start with you, Darren. This is controversial to some groups, but clearly the government sees this as a political battle they want to have.
Yeah, indeed. When you look at what the Just Oil protesters or Just Stop Oil Extinction Rebellion, there has been an awful lot of disruption to rail networks and road networks and to general kind of people's lives in recent months and years, to the point where, at certain points, ambulances were struggling to get through traffic jams caused by these protesters. And there is a sense that actually the public, when it frankly comes down to it, really aren't on the side of the protesters on the whole, even if they are maybe potentially with some of the intentions at least behind it. And so the government do think this is a pretty easy win. Now, there are a lot of people who would argue the police largely actually already have the powers to do lots of the stuff to end these protests anyway. However, the police have welcomed the addition of these extra powers, though perhaps that's a little unsurprising. And this essentially allows police officers to get involved before the disruption actually properly happens. If they think there's going to be disruption, like we're seeing on your screen right now, that they could preventatively stop that from happening. Now, groups like Liberty say that is too far, that it could be abused by the police, that it could stifle the right to protest in this country. But you're right, in the end, politically, the government thinks it's got an awful lot of cover on this because, frankly, people are, on the whole, I would suggest, sick and tired of seeing protests that isn't just protesting, but causing widespread disruption.
And Olivia, this puts the Labour Party in an interesting position because they've been trying to seem more like the party of law and order. Where do you think they're going to land on this?
Well, absolutely. I expect that they'll end up landing on some sort of fudge, some sort of this law won't work.
Sitting on the fence. I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
What we've seen from the Labour Party before is rather than expressing a view on the principle of the thing over whether strikes, protests should be curtailed in order to allow ordinary people to go about their working lives, what they might do is something whereby they say that, a law like this won't work, which is exactly what they've done with the strikes. They haven't actually said that they're against the principle of curtailing strikers' rights. They've just said that this law couldn't possibly work. But we can expect to see some pushback probably from the libertarian right of the Conservative Party as well, who are deeply worried about the idea of curtailing protesters. And although...
So after all, this doesn't just affect Extinction Rebellion protesters. Anyone who wanted to organise a protest, you could see how a different form of government might use that to crack down on other groups.
Exactly. And Rishi Sunak will try and frame this as not anything like a crackdown on protests, but merely a sort of clarification of existing law. And how he'll do that is, for example, one of the measures that will be brought in under this amendment to the Public Order Act will be defining slow walking protests as causing serious disruption. And what we saw last year is we saw these slow walkers of Just Stop Oil walking down London, essentially bringing traffic to a complete standstill, and police were unable to intervene because it wasn't clear whether or not slow walking counted as a serious disruption, which made the public who were stuck in these traffic jams absolutely furious with the police.
Which is bonkers, because anyone looking at that can see that they're clearly blocking the road. You'd think under the Highways Act they'd be able to act. Have the police just been too timid?
Well, it seems as though the police have just... police officers have been acting differently in different areas, which is another problem for the Prime Minister. So, yes, in some areas it feels as though they have been being too timid, but in others it could be said that they've gone beyond what existing legislation allows. So Rishi Sunak will argue that this amendment to the Public Order Bill will just sort of even things up, level the playing field, make things clear, and it's not at all about curtailing protesters' rights. But whether or not either the Labour Party or the Libertarian right of his own party will accept that is another matter.
It's likely that that's going to be a pretty popular thing for the government to pursue, but there's another issue that really has been intractable within British politics for some time, and that, of course, is the very complicated situation we're seeing in Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland, to some extent, is being treated as if it's a bit of a province of the European Union rather than a fully fledged part of the United Kingdom. We're hearing, though, that there may well be a deal approaching on this area. Darren McCaffrey, you were reporting in Brussels for many of those years of the most fraught Brexit negotiations. Can you explain to us what is meant when we read in the papers about a tunnel perhaps approaching? What's a tunnel?
It's not a physical tunnel, you'll be glad to know, Tom, but it is this sense where when talks get down to the final end bit where they get quite sensitive, let's be clear about this, that essentially people turn off the phones, they chuck in the bin, there's no leaking, and my God, Westminster is leaky, but Brussels is even worse. It's like a sieve, it leaks so much. So in theory, this is really serious, guys. We're not allowed to kind of start, leaking positions and that sort of stuff. And you get a kind of negotiators essentially locked in a room, if you like, almost like, not actual literally, but somewhat metaphorically, and they just keep talking until they actually iron out a deal. Now, the reason we're seeing this, and this actually largely involves the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly along with his EU counterparts, is because there's an awful lot of political pressure in Northern Ireland to get this sorted. We're coming up in April to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, that landmark deal that affected the end of the Civil War in Northern Ireland. We have not had Storm at the Northern Ireland Executive sitting for well over a year now, having fallen apart because unions were pretty angry about the protocol. And yes, it does seem with this kind of big deal that was struck a couple of weeks ago in terms of sharing data, real-time data when it comes to the flow of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, that it does look like a deal could be done. The big question, of course, is how will two groups react to that? How will unionists react? Do they think it will go far enough in getting rid of that border, the so-called border in the Irish Sea? And also, how will the ERG, those Brexiteers within the Conservative Party, will they see this as a betrayal? And that will be the two key tests for Rishi Sunak if there is a deal.
Really fascinating that a deal could be on the horizon there. Just finally, there is also another aspect of union policy where there is a deadline this week, Wednesday, I believe, where the Prime Minister must make a decision as to whether or not to strike down a piece of legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament that has not yet received royal assent. They're gender reforms. Olivia, it looks pretty likely the Prime Minister is going to enact Section 35 of the Scotland Act for the first time in the history of this country.
It does look like he's going to do that, and it would be unprecedented. It's an interesting issue because there is talk in Westminster and in Holyrood now that it's possible that Nicola Sturgeon brought forward this hugely controversial legislation, which was rushed through Holyrood at the end of last year. I mean, sittings until 2 o'clock in the morning to get this bill over the line. There is talk that she might have, part of her motivation for bringing it in could have been to pick a constitutional row with the Westminster government, because she believes that the best thing to do is create a sort of roadblock between England and Scotland. And it does put Rishi Sunak in a very difficult position, this bill, because if you have a different definition, say, of what the word woman is in Scotland and in England, you could come into problems whereby someone who is a male-bodied person who's awaiting trial for sexual offences could gain a gender recognition certificate in Scotland and end up being sent to a women's prison in England. I mean, it's unlikely, but hypothetically, that could happen.
Within Scotland, under the terms of this bill, it would still be a matter of individual assessment for people going to prisons or otherwise. Is it the concern of the government that it's just more likely that with a GRC that would change the terms of assessment?
So under the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, it essentially takes away all checks and balances to people who want to change their gender. So instead of needing a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, all one would have to do is live in an acquired gender for 3 months or 6 months if you're between 16 and 18.
Whereas currently that's 2 years.
Exactly. And there has to be some sort of professional intervention as well. And the Gender Recognition Reform Bill would remove all that. So it does put Rishi Sunak in a difficult position because of the ramifications it would have in England. And his argument is that it might be incompatible with the UK-wide 2004 Equalities Act. So that's what he'll be arguing.
Yeah.
And if he does go ahead with it, we know that it's going to pose a huge constitutional problem. And we already have both Nicola Sturgeon and Stephen Flynn, the SNP man in Westminster, saying that whatever you think about the gender issue, this is now a matter of democracy. And if Westminster chooses to stand in the way of a bill that has been passed by a majority in Holyrood, then that would essentially count as Westminster roadblocking Scotland's democracy. So this is going to be a big issue about what's really quite a niche subject.
And absolutely fascinatingly, the Labour Party backed this reform in Scotland. It is proposing this reform in Wales. And yet in England, Sir Keir Starmer is sort of sitting on the fence as to whether or not to block it, Darren Caffrey.
Yeah, he was on the TV yesterday saying that, there are large parts he thinks of the system in England that doesn't work, but on the whole he doesn't agree with the legislation introduced in Scotland because, not least of all, it is open to 16-year-olds who he thinks is too young. But yeah, I mean, there is more than a bit of a row within the Labour Party, about Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party across the UK, and yet, you've got Scottish Labour in a very different position, and as you say, Welsh Labour as well. From the government's point of view, they say, and they would argue, this is not about this issue to a large degree. It is not, as in terms of politics, it is about the legality of all of this, i.e. with the Equalities Act in England, they have to act. Dominic Grieve was on the radio this morning, of course, the former Conservative Attorney General, saying that actually, in many ways, yes, this has been treated as a constitutional issue, but ultimately it is a legal act that the government have to take because it would cut across those equality laws. However, of course, the ramifications politically are enormous. There is no doubt about that, though it does look to try and assuage people a little bit that the government may bring forward the conversion therapy legislation that they've been talking about for the last 5 years, and that could include people in the transgender community. So
it's almost a bit of a tit for tat there. Yes, we're going to block this, but we might do a liberalisation here, and so it's sort of
but
playing
yeah,
both
of course,
sides.
I mean, there is no doubt the SNP will exploit this. It is going to cause a hell of a row, and Will it, frankly, stoke Scottish nationalism? It's entirely possible it will.
Absolutely fascinating there. Let's keep our ears close to the ground on that as it continues. But there's another big decision that was made over the course of the weekend, and that's after a series of missile strikes rained down across Ukraine, 14 people were killed in Dnipro. Well, Rishi Sunak has since confirmed that over a dozen tanks are now to be sent to Ukraine from the UK to assist their war effort. This is a change in UK government policy. Let's discuss it now with Bob Seeley, the former foreign correspondent in the USSR, Conservative MP now, of course. Bob, you also hold a PhD in Russian military strategy, I believe.
That's true, Tom.
So let's dive in. Why haven't we sent weapons like tanks until this stage?
Good morning, Tom. Good morning to your listeners and viewers. I think that's because there's been a nervousness in the West about doing so. So major pieces of kit like air power, like tanks, have in the past been seen as an escalation. But I think the Russian tactics of hitting civilian infrastructure and trying to make life hellish for the 40 million or so residents in Ukraine, or Ukrainian citizens, I think has changed that dynamic. I think the reason why we're doing it is to provide political leadership and political cover so that other countries will send their tanks as well. And primarily this is about sending German Leopard tanks, of which there are over 3,000 in Western Europe and North America.
It is interesting that the Germans have seemed to be very slow-moving on all of this at every stage. They do tend to catch up with the Western coalition, but only after a huge amount of political pressure. Is it your view that Germany now will send their Leopard tanks thanks to the leadership of countries like the UK?
I think there is still a problem, and the mood music from Berlin is that, and from Rheinmetall that made the tanks, is that they're not willing to send until next year, which is way too late. All the options facing Ukraine and, frankly, facing the Western alliance are bad, because this is a war that is killing thousands of people a week. The least bad option for the Western alliance is to now arm the Ukrainians to win the war this year. Everything else becomes more dangerous and more destabilizing for Europe and the world, because the more desperate and aggressive and violent Russia will become. So the least bad option is that the Ukrainians have the kit to win this year, and currently they don't have the kit to do that. They need a minimum of 200, 300 main battle tanks, Western main battle tanks, and probably 500 to 600 infantry fighting vehicles on top of the huge amounts of supplies. And the West has already been generous. But the least bad option, the least dangerous option for us now is to arm the Ukrainians to win this year. And if the Germans don't supply the tanks, that won't happen.
200 or 300 tanks seems like quite a lot in comparison to the just over a dozen that the United Kingdom are sending. Is the UK doing enough?
Yeah. Well, look, the UK could send 50 Challenger, and that would be great. But realistically, 14 is a squadron of tanks. And on a front line, which is over 1,000 kilometres, 14 tanks is not going to make a significant military difference, although it will be a considerable addition. If I remember my, armoured regiments, you need about 50. There's about 50 tanks in a regiment. So we're not even supplying a regiment of tanks to the Ukrainians. So this is about the politics of this. This is about us taking the lead, taking some flack, which we'll get from the Russians, and persuading other countries. And it's about not necessarily the Germans supplying the tanks themselves, but the Germans agreeing for other nations that have Leopard tanks to export them. So Finland, I think, has them. Poland has them. Austria has them. The Canadians have them. So it's about persuading these countries to give those tanks, the Danes have them, to maybe donate some of those tanks to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians want Leopard above all else because they seem to be versatile. There's a lot of them around. But if we can supply more ourselves, then we should be doing so. Look, credit for Rishi, credit for Ben for doing this. I think it's, again, really important leadership on behalf of the British. But we need to do more if we're going to enable the Ukrainians to win this year. And that is the least dangerous option for us all.
It's absolutely fascinating how this is so much more tactical than perhaps it would look at first inspection, that the British strategy has been about sort of pushing other countries to do similar things rather than it being our kit that makes the fundamental difference, as perhaps it did at the start of this war. Just finally, Bob Seeley.
I'm not so sure, just Tom, on that point. I mean, we think that NLAW saved the day. I don't quite buy that. I think it enabled us to say that we saved the day. I think the javelin that the US had been supplying for years before were important. I think our training was useful, but actually what saved the day was the old-fashioned Soviet artillery the Ukrainians had, and that enabled them to defeat the Russians just north of Kiev. So I think we are in danger of overplaying. We played an important role, for sure, but actually if we'd had more nous, the way to avoid this war would have been arming the Ukrainians properly beforehand, and I'm very sorry that didn't happen, because thousands of people are now dying as a result of President Putin's opportunism and disastrous adventurism.
Big lessons to learn for the future. I'm afraid we've run to the end of our allotted time, but Bob Seeley, always appreciate you on the show. Really, really interesting stuff there. Just finally, this week, of course, the online safety bill will enter its final stages in the Commons, that big piece of online regulation. Rishi Sunak hopes to push it through, but is facing considerable sustained rebellions from nearly 50 of his own backbenchers. Now, these are over multiple different amendments, but will the bill pass cleanly, and should it? Well, Matthew Lesh is head of the public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and joins us now. Matthew, thank you for joining us this morning. The bill has said to, or at least the Culture Secretary says the bill has changed from how it was under the previous Culture Secretary. Is it allowing for a more free internet now than it otherwise would have?
Look, on the margins, I think the government has certainly improved the bill. It's in other ways, you could argue it's gotten worse. The bill is longer than it used to be. It's more complex. It's more cumbersome. It's going to potentially provide more barriers to innovation. Where the government did make some positive changes is they're no longer listing so-called legal but harmful categories of content that they expect major companies to deal with, and they've replaced that with a separate duty to ensure enforcement of terms and conditions. Now, that raises some other issues about, well, does Ofcom ensure that the terms and conditions enforced are actually quite censorious, because a lot of big companies don't have particularly pro-free speech provisions. And at the same time, the government hasn't dealt with a lot of the other issues in the bill, the issues about general monitoring of content in order to remove priority errors. So this is the government requiring companies to have automated systems to remove all sorts of different types of content. There's other sections of the bill that undermine encryption and could mean that WhatsApp has said that they might not be able to operate in the UK if they're forced to read everyone's messages, because they consider that a basic affront to the first principles of their platform. At the same time, you've got to understand that this bill still is extremely complex, extremely burdensome on companies. It's going to end up being a boon for the biggest tech companies, but it's going to provide big barriers to entry for smaller companies, and it's going to apply to the likes of Mumsnet or Wikipedia, or if you have a discussion forum on your website, these extraordinary set of duties will apply to you and could, as a result, lead people to setting up elsewhere in the world.
It's fascinating that under Rishi Sunak, someone who ostensibly sort of came through the sort of California tech world, is now going to be putting so many duties upon tech businesses in this country. It's hard to see how the UK could become a big sort of tech superpower, how we could have this sort of replica of Silicon Valley over here. They say world leading on one side, but I suppose on the other side of the ledger, it's sort of no one else in the world has really done this, for a reason perhaps.
Yeah. Well, indeed, when you hear world leading, you have to wonder who you're competing with for global censorship. You're trying to compete with Russia or China or Saudi Arabia. But on this innovation point, I mean, what is ironic about the whole situation is the UK has chosen to leave the European Union, but decided instead to put what is gold-plated online safety regulation that will make the UK a much worse place to set up a digital business compared to the EU, with much vaguer requirements, many more duties, much stricter censorship and monitoring duties on the companies than existed within the EU's equivalent digital markets bill. So I think the UK is definitely not really putting itself out there as a global beacon of hope when it comes to digital and tech by putting forward this kind of legislation.
And a fascinating battle to be had over the next day or so as to whether or not the government picks up this amendment that would potentially put in prison tech executives. I'm not sure how well that would attract inward investment, but I'm afraid we have to leave it there. It's the end of the show. Matt Lesh, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your time. That's it for me. Back, of course, 9:30 tomorrow morning. But up next, it's Bev Turner Today.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family. Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Very good morning. Welcome to Bev Turner Today on GB News. Thank you for joining me on TV, DAB radio and online. It is officially the most miserable day of the year. I know, so if you're feeling a bit down today, you're not alone. Stay with me for the next 2 hours and my guests and I will do what we can to keep your spirits lifted. It's a big day for the controversial public order bill, which the government is seeking to toughen up before it becomes law. If passed, it will mean that police can shut down disruptive protests preemptively before they become disruptive. Civil liberties supporters say that the plans go way too far, but maybe you're OK with that if it stops the Just Stop Oil protesters blocking the roads. And we're looking forward to getting stuck into that and much more with ex-SAS trooper Phil Campion and author Amy Nickel. Plus news on teachers' strikes and the latest royal rumours about King Charles's reaction to Harry. That's all coming up after a look at the latest news with Tamsin.
Bev, thanks very much. Good morning from the